Hey guys, this week's video is going to be on sequential multi-port fuel injection systems. We're going to particularly be looking at fuel injectors, but anyway, here you can see we have a diagram for an '06 Suzuki Grand Vitara, and it is a V6, and you can see that we have 6 injectors there, and it is a multi-port system, so each of those injectors is placed at the end of the intake runner for each cylinder, and it's pointed down into the runners on the cylinder heads. But just looking at the diagram, you can tell that it is a sequential system because each one of those injectors has its own ground wire, and each of them is low side driven by the ECM. So essentially, the drivers inside the ECM can control how many times those injectors are fired or how fast they're fired, and it can also control the on time for the injectors depending upon different conditions and different inputs that the ECM is basing its fueling on.
Alright, so here you can see we're actually on the car, and upon visual inspection you can see, it's hard to see through the camera, but we have our bank 1 fuel rail. Let's see if I can actually get down here and show you an injector on the rail. It's real hard to see in there, but there's one injector, and that plumbs through right to the bottom of the runner on the intake manifold. And so here's our bank 1 rail, and then we got our bank 2 rail here, and there is a crossover at the end, and you can't see them, but there's 2 lines that run under this intake hose, one that plumbs into the bank 2 line first, so your fuel is going to run into the bank 2 rail, and then through the bank 2 rail, cross over at the back, come over to the bank 1 rail, and it ends at our pressure regulator. So this is a return style system. You can see here's our return line, and this regulator is controlled by vacuum. We have a vacuum line that runs right up to a port on the intake, and that's going to determine how much vacuum we have is going to determine how much that pressure is regulated and how much fuel is sent back to the tank.
Alright, so here I thought I'd drop in a little diagram of a vacuum fuel pressure regulator, and this is a regulator that you're going to see on most return style systems, but basically the gist of it is that with more vacuum you're going to have less fuel pressure, more fuel returning back to the tank, and with less vacuum you're going to have higher fuel pressure. Anyway, now we're going to start looking at injectors.
Alright, so here we're actually doing a voltage drop test across this number 3 injector here, and you can see I'm probed into the ground wire on the injector, and I have my other meter lead on the power for battery. You can see the keys forward and we have no volts. We're going to start the car and see what we have with it running, but quickly, just to explain what we're doing here, is we have our battery positive, obviously, our injector, and then our engine control module. So you can see here where we're measuring for voltage drop. We're on the battery positive and we're on the ground side of that injector, and you can see the PCM or ECM controls the ground to that injector. So right now it's open, so that's why we're not going to have a full voltage drop across here. Positive potential is running all the way through the injector into the open switch in the ECM.
So what you see here is the voltage drop across that injector with the car running at idle, and you can see we have about 0.4 volts dropping across, and this is a good injector, so at idle this is about what you should see.
Okay, so here we're plugged into a functioning injector, and we have an amp clamp on the driver circuit wire, and we're probed in with the picoscope as well, and we have our graph up kind of centered so you can see it. This is what a properly functioning saturated switch graph will look like. So you can see here where we drop 0 volts. This is our actual on time for the driver circuit, and you can see here in the amperage ramp how there's a little deviation there, and then while our voltage spike is coming back down, there's also a little deviation at hump. This deviation is where the injector itself is actually opening, and this deviation is where it's closing. And you'd be able to see with different conditions. We made a vacuum leak, and you can see how it affects the on time of that injector. Obviously, more fuel, you're gonna have, if the PCM wants more fuel, it's gonna increase that on time a little bit. Or with RPM, you're just gonna have more opening and closings of the injector. And it's also worth mentioning here at the top of the voltage spike, you can see it's cut out, and that's because we have a Zener diode bleeding that voltage spike off. If we didn't have a Zener diode, you would see the spike come up to an actual point. It wouldn't be abruptly cut off there. So that's just a little explanation of what's going on here, and we'll take the trigger off and give the car some RPM, and you'll be able to see how it actually increases with RPM, the amount of times that the injector is opening and closing.
Okay, so now that we've taken that trigger off, we're going to increase the engine RPM so that way you guys can see how it affects the sound wave. So Mikey's gonna do this. All right, Mikey, go ahead. Okay, you can see our signals got a lot closer together.
Alright, so here, just for giggles, thought I'd throw in a little video of testing a bad injector. So we have an injector that was OL on an ohm test, and we plugged it into the functioning circuit on the car. You can still see we have the picoscope graphs up, and it's interesting because, well, for one, there's no amperage flow, which we figured that would happen, but with the voltage, we actually had 2.5 volts on that ground wire, and it was still cycling on and off, but even with it internally open, somehow voltage was still getting across there in a weird phenomenon. I can't exactly explain why or how, but I just thought that might be worth, throwing in the video because I thought it was pretty interesting.